Well, hello, family of God, and thank you for joining me again today. As we begin today, I wonder if you can picture this scene from Genesis 21. Can you picture Hagar and Ishmael shuffling down the road early that morning, leaving behind the only home they've ever known, and carrying really nothing with them but just that little bit of water, those few bits of bread that old Father Abraham thought to give to them before he kicked them out the door and sent them on their way? And can you picture the two of them stumbling around in the shimmering heat of the desert, growing increasingly disoriented and desperate with every step? And can you picture the two of them taking their last sips of water through lips that are cracked and dry, and then collapsing in the dirt, Ishmael under his bush, Hagar under hers, both of them just laying there, waiting to die? It's a heartrending scene that the writer of Genesis draws for us. But of course, the ancient author isn't finished yet. Because the ancient author tells us that once Ishmael and Hagar have collapsed there in the dirt, once they've laid there for a while and just kind of wondered how long it's all going to last, when it's finally all going to end for them, well, the ancient author tells us that as the two lay there under the hot desert sun, they begin to cry. I imagine that Ishmael lets out the frightened and anxious whimper of the child that he is, this child who's confused, who doesn't understand what's going on, who just wants to go back home. But I also imagine that Hagar, for her part, is less restrained. The way I imagine it, Hagar thinks back on her life. Hagar remembers all the things that have gone wrong for her and now for her child. She thinks about all the ways that she's been used and abused and mistreated throughout her life. She thinks about how she's now been, thrown to the curb, tossed out like the trash, treated like last week's leftover lasagna. Hagar thinks about all of that, and then Hagar lets out this primal scream that cuts through the dry desert air and bounces off the canyon walls and could be heard for miles around. If only there was someone there to hear it. Only the way I've always imagined this scene, there is no one there to hear it. It's just Hagar. It's just Ishmael screaming out into the void with no one to hear their cry. That's how I've pictured it, but of course if you paid attention when the text was read this morning, you've probably already picked up that that's not quite right. It's not quite right because what the text tells us is that God was there. And God heard the sobs of Hagar. And God listened to the cries of Ishmael. And friends, isn't that wonderful? I mean, think of it. When Hagar and Ishmael cry out in the wilderness, well, God does not respond by coming to them and maybe scolding them and saying, "Now, can't you two be quiet? Don't you know I have more important things to do? I'm very busy today." God doesn't do that. And God doesn't come, wagging his finger to Ishmael and saying, now Ishmael, you know you had this coming. You know you should not have mistreated your brother this way. You know, if you had just been a little better person, this wouldn't have happened. You wouldn't be in this situation right now. No, God doesn't do that. And God doesn't come to Hagar with a lecture either. God doesn't come to Hagar and say, "Now, Hagar, why are you bothering me about the life of your son? I mean, come on, Hagar, don't you know that all lives matter? What is this you're saying to me?" No, that's not how the story goes. Instead, what happens is that Hagar and Ishmael, they cry out. Right? They weep and they wail, and God listens. Of course, there's more to the story than that, but that's where the story begins. Right? That's where the good news begins for Hagar and Ishmael, and I believe that's where the good news begins for us, too. Sherry Turkle is a professor at MIT who's done a lot of writing about how technology has shaped the way we communicate with each other. And a few years ago, Dr. Turkle gave an interview on NPR where she recalled a visit that she had made to a nursing home as a part of her research. Staff of that nursing home was showing her around, and as they showed her around, they came into one of these big open rooms, and they spotted this frail old woman slumped in her wheelchair, clinging this doll to her chest. And they pointed her out to Dr. Turkle because they thought this was kind of a cool story. They said, this is a woman who lost her son at some point in her life, and she was just desperate to tell someone this story. But they were busy people. Right? The staff had so many people to take care of, and she didn't have any family, so they came up with what was a rather ingenious solution, they thought. What they did is they found this doll. This doll was actually kind of a robot, and it was programmed to imitate human responses and human empathy. So the woman could talk to the doll, and the doll was programmed to just respond with kind of sympathetic, I'm sorry. That must be hard for you. That's really sad. Well, Dr. Turkle says everyone in the room seemed kind of proud of this answer, very happy with this solution to this problem. But she saw things differently. She says, everybody was so happy, but to me, it was the saddest moment. It was sad, she said, because the question was not whether or not this woman would talk. The question was there anyone listening? And there was no one listening. Well, I think one bit of good news and hope that Genesis 21 gives us is that no matter how it may have appeared in the nursing home that day, someone was listening. Because God was listening. God was listening because that's one thing this story from Genesis 21 makes clear. It makes clear that this is the kind of God that we have. We have a God who listens. In fact, this was actually hinted at earlier in the story. In chapter 16, when Ishmael gets his name, the writer tells us that that's what the name Ishmael actually means. The name means God hears or God listens. And see, friends, this is who God is. This is the kind of thing God does. And so often in Scripture, this is where the good news begins. It begins with this God who listens. So God listens to Hagar and Ishmael sobbing in the wilderness. But God also listens to the groans of the children of Israel in slavery and captivity in Egypt. And God listens to the desperate pleas of the psalmist crying out to the pit. And in the New Testament, God listens. Right? God listens to us in and through the person of Jesus Christ. Maybe that doesn't strike you as remarkable, but I think it should. One scholar, he surveys the evidence of this God who listens throughout Scripture, and he summarizes things this way. He says, yes, in Scripture, God is a God of speech. The true king has spoken the prime word from which all words find their source, and he will have the last words when all words fall silent at his feet. But, he said, what might blindside us, and I would say what should blindside us, is the discovery that the God of the Bible listens. The cosmos hangs together by his word. Galaxies and constellations obey when he speaks. But the undisputed champion of creation is a listener. Friends, that's what kind of God we have. We have a God who listens. And what's more remarkable still, I think, is that we have a God who listens not only to those who the world calls important, not only to those who are powerful, not only to those whose lives seem perfect and so well put together, No, the God who comes to us, who humbles himself in the person of Jesus Christ. Scripture says this God bends down. He stoops over like a father to his child. And he listens to the weak and to the vulnerable. He listens to those who are so easily overlooked and whose pain is so often easily forgotten. So yes, God listens to the pleas of Hagar and Ishmael, to these two desperate souls who maybe you noticed the other characters in the story can't even bring themselves to name. They're just that woman's son. God listens to their sobs. But God also listens, I believe, to the cries of that broken-hearted mother in the nursing home. And God listens to the anxious sighs of the man sitting in the doctor's office trying to absorb the bad news, or standing by the graveside of a loved one trying to accept the reality of the worst thing. And God listens to the sobs of the child who lays in his bed at night after the lights have been turned off and his parents have gone back downstairs, but the child who's anxious and afraid, who feels so alone and unloved, who maybe feels like she'll never measure up in school, who's maybe terrified that her parents don't love each other anymore, and maybe it's her fault. God listens to that child, and friend, God listens to the spouse, to the weeping of the spouse who feels belittled and betrayed and abused by the person who is supposed to love her most. And I think he also listens to the weeping of the person who did the belittling and the abusing, now full of remorse and regret. And God also listens to the cries of the refugee who has left behind the only home he's ever known. And he listens to the anguished laments of people of color in this country who feels for so long diminished and demeaned and dehumanized because of the color of their skin. God listens. Friends, I think that's good news for us today, good news that ought to comfort us. But I think it's also good news that can challenge us. I think it can challenge us because, well, as people whose calling in life is to make God known, to show the world who he is and what he is like, well, how do we do that? Well, I'd say maybe one of the first things on our priority list ought to be to listen. And I think that's probably not easy for many of us, maybe even at any time in the history of the world, but maybe especially at this time. You know, I think we live in this cultural moment where it seems that everybody wants to speak and talk, but not many people are interested in listening. Right? Everybody is interested in being heard, but not many people are interested in doing the hearing. I mean, it seems like, to me, like we live in this moment where everyone's supposed to have an opinion about everything, and then they're supposed to either post that opinion on social media or proclaim it loudly to their friends who agree with them. And if people don't agree with them, well, what happens is we talk over and through and past and on top of one another. Right? That's just what passes for discourse these days. It seems to be the normal state of affairs. But that's true. I think this is one of those places where Christians need to be a little abnormal. Right? Christians need to be different. I would say that's especially true for people like myself who are in positions of privilege and power. And I'd say that's true for anyone, by the way, who's a part of majority white culture in this country. Right? Just the simple reality is we've got some unique privileges and unique positions of power just because of the color of our skin in this country. So friends, if we really want to make God known, Right? If we really want to show the world what God is like, especially in this moment, right? Especially at this time when so many people of color and minority communities are taking to the streets and voicing their pain, I would say one of the first things we need to do is it's not to talk. It's not to give an answer. It's not to explain away. Now, I would say one of the first things we need to do is to shut our mouths, to open our ears, and to listen. No, it seems like such a simple thing. But it's a wonderful book of a listening life, a book that's been really helpful to me. A writer named Adam McHugh, he talks about the profound impact being listened to had on him as a student. The way McHugh tells it, he was serving during his seminary days as a chaplaincy intern in a hospital, working on a floor, I believe, of all cancer patients. But he had this 4-month chaplaincy internship, and as a part of that internship, he had to meet every week with his supervisor for a one-on-one meeting. Meet with this woman named Donna. And I'm just going to maybe test your listening skills a little bit today, but I'm just going to read to you what he says about that experience. Donna. He says, Donna was my supervisor, and when she and I met individually in the first week, I braced myself for the standard instruction, correction, and advice. But that day, I encountered a different kind of leadership. I met an authority figure who listened to me. Donna was interested in me, not in telling me what to do or shaping me into her image. Instead, she asked me what I thought and felt, what I cared about, what my family was like, who I wanted to be. She listened to me so intently that I would get uncomfortable talking about myself for so long. I would try to turn the conversation toward her, but she always knew how to redirect it back to me. Don and I continued to meet that fall. I began to realize that I wasn't her project. She wasn't looking for what she needed to fix about me. The more she listened to me, the more I began to see myself the way she did, as a person. I wasn't a sick patient, which is the message I had received from previous mentors who seemed intent in performing emergency surgery on my soul. I've been told 1,000 times that God loved me, and I don't remember whether Donna ever said that during our weekly meetings. But I completed that internship knowing God's love in ways I never had before. I began to feel a new kind of peace within myself. And I was filled with a new level of energy for ministry, one that was not motivated by emptiness, but by fullness. Because I had received one of God's greatest gifts, the gift of being truly heard. Friends, that gift of being heard, it is truly one of God's great gifts to us. It's a gift that He's secured for us in Jesus Christ, who's made a way for us into God's presence, and who assures us that we will always be heard by Him. Friends, that is one of God's great gifts to us. So having received that gift, may God, by His Spirit, equip us and enable us to share that gift with everyone we meet this week. Grace and peace, dear friends. I hope you have a good week.